So welcome everyone. So we'll have five papers today. So we'll aim for 30 minutes, but again, we are a bit flexible. So I would say 25 plus questions, and I think we can take questions along the way. You can assume that people will be familiar with the topic. So at least a part of the motivation of why it's important to work on the public employment, you don't have to you don't have to focus on that. So public employment is very important from different angles. So it's important from a labor market perspective because it represents such a large proportion of employment. It's important from a budgetary perspective. So it's one of the key items of spending in the yearly preparations of the budget. It's the public workers are the ones that provide public goods and services. So key workers, frontline workers. And it's also a political issue. So it's very important during electoral campaigns, and it's used to gain political support. During the euro area crisis, there was this debate of austerity was linked largely to public employment and wages, and now with the COVID pandemic, put again the focus on having a modern public sector, so with a capable workforce to deal with unpredictable crises. But it also puts emphasis on the costs, and governments with very large debts will have to start thinking about the cost of public employment. Now, when we go to the debate, the debate, it's vibrant, but it's always or often based in perceptions rather than facts. So often you see this reduced to a sterile confrontation of the bunch of lazy bureaucrats to be cut, the supporters of austerity versus the public sector needs generous wages to deliver high quality services. So usually the supporters of public spending. Now, when it comes to the literature, it's quite surprising. So there was a very large interest in the 70s all the way up until the 90s, but especially in the 70s and 80s. And you had lots of American economic reviews, Kruger working on this, Borjas was working on public employment. There was really a big attraction, but it just diminished in the 2000s. So between 2000 and 2010, only 2 out of 10,000 NBER papers mentioned public employment, and the same for the ISA working papers. So public employment essentially disappeared from the macro literature. Now, since the crisis, there's been this new wave of research on labor markets, especially on the labor market effects of public sector employment and wages, and it's basically in this literature that kind of staging a renaissance of the public employment literature that this workshop is based. So I wanted just to reflect. So the thing why I like the public employment is also the thing that makes it so hard. It's its complexity, because it lies in the intersection of several economic fields. So you have from the macroeconomics of labor markets, but also macroeconomics of fiscal policy. Then you have political economy and public economics. And then you go all the way to more micro level topics like applied labor economics, personal economics of the government, human resources, and public administration. So I think part of the difficulty lies that you have public employment being in the interaction of all these fields. So then you always, when you approach it from one angle, then you're obviously abstracting for all the other angles that are also important. So that makes it kind of very, very complex. Now, one point that I think is very important is this distinction of 2 dimensions that are always present. And one, so an idea of quantities, but also prices. So here you have one chart that you have government employment as relative to private sector employment on the x-axis, and the government wage bill as a percentage of the private sector wage bill. This is for 2008. And what you see that there is a huge variation across countries on the size of employment, so the quantities. You also see that the more governments, the more workers they hire, they also pay more. So that's the positive slope. But then you find that there is a huge variation in terms of the size of the wage bill relative to the headcount. And in this particular case, in 2008, you had all these 6 countries, and that it's not that they had a very large level of public employment headcount, but just how much they were spending on was much larger relative to their size. So there's always this issue about employment and wages, so the quantities and prices, and there are many issues on the size of employment of wages and how they vary across country or over time. There are very important issues of composition, and some of the papers will talk either the heterogeneity by gender, heterogeneity by education, or by age, or by region. On the theory, there are kind of 2 main lines, and one is trying to understand why the government follows certain policies. And this was very big in the 70s and 80s. And this is a lot of the literature on political economy and public economics, on why do governments, how do they decide on wages, how do they decide on employment. The question that raised now in the recent literature, which is where all of us are inserted, is this: what are the effects? So it's more a positive analysis. Is what are the effects on the labor market, or in the case of one of the papers on the effects on growth, but it's more taking the employment and wages from the data, so taking as a policy variables and trying to understand what are the effects in the economy. The other branch that was bigger in the 70s, but it often comes, at least when people discuss my work, is why do governments follow certain but so that there was a big literature in the 70s on it. So this particular workshop, so we'll have 5 presentations, and you'll see that they cover a very different variety of topics. So one is about the interaction of public employment with the minimum wage, and it focuses on workers, this heterogeneity by education. Then you'll have a second paper is about the selection procedure in the public sector and how it affects the selection of workers by unobserved heterogeneity. So the quality of workers and how the selection occurs in the public, but then when you talk about the selection into the public, you are also talking about the selection into the private sector. I will present a paper on why do women select into the public sector. And then Vincenzo will talk about the cyclicality. So while the previous papers, it's really about steady state, then the fourth paper is about the cyclicality, the cyclical policies for wages and employment. And then the last paper is more from a long run perspective on how can public employment affect the growth rates. So you can see already the kind of the variety of different topics, but it's also a variety of different methodologies. So 4 of the papers will be on search. So these will be the focus mainly on the labor market, but even the 4 papers, they all have different approaches. So I find they are really complementary to each other. So one paper really thinks about random search and heterogeneity by education, but also has match-specific productivity. This second paper, it's about unobserved ability and segmented markets, so people with different abilities choosing where to go. The third paper I'll present my own, it's also segmented markets, but there will be heterogeneity by gender and 3-state labor market. And the paper on cyclicality will be also with random search, and then we have a growth model. So you can really see that there's a lot of scope of different types of models to explore different mechanisms to understand the effects of public employment. So this is what I wanted to say, just to place everything in perspective. I think we can start with Mauricio and Lucas. So we try to keep the time on 30 minutes, aim for 25. we can have questions during, and yeah. Okay.
Okay. Do you hear me? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you, Pedro, for organizing this and to bring together people with common interests, and we can. I believe it's going to be very, very productive. This workshop. Given the nature, the informal nature of the workshop, we decided with Lucas. This paper is written with Lucas Navarro to share the talk. So he's gonna start he's gonna outline more or less the motivation and the model, and at the end I'm gonna talk about the estimation strategy we have and the results of the paper. So Lucas, if you wanna start.
Okay, thank you. Let me join Mauricio in thanking Pedro for organizing this conference and for inviting us to present our paper. I think it's going to be very good experience. Let me go to just the motivation, as I'm just going to take Pedro's words on that we don't need to motivate that much on why the public sector is important. But let me just say that the public sector is a large employer in many labor markets, and there is also another fact we are interested in our paper, which is the minimum wage. And for the specific case of the Chilean labor market, which is the market we are interested in our paper, given the data we use in the paper, we have that not only the public sector is a large employer, with more than 13 workers in our sample, 13% of the workers in our sample working in the public sector, but also the minimum wage seems to be binding as more than 30% of private sector workers earn wages that are up to 1.2 minimum wages in the private sector, and in the public sector, 18% of the workers earn wages up to 1.2 minimum wages. So we'll go to the next slide. In this context, then, increases in the minimum wage not only would have an impact, a direct impact in the wage bill in both sectors, but they would also have an impact in the functioning of the labor market. And we are interested in studying the interaction between the minimum wage and public sector employment in our paper, and this is related in a way to what I've just mentioned, but also to the fact that the literature on the minimum wage is very, very large, but the results are still mixed and not conclusive. In terms of other papers studying the impact of the minimum wage on the public sector, there is a very scarce empirical literature with results which are inconclusive as well. So our main challenge is to analyze these equilibrium effects that might be at work in this framework, in the interaction between the minimum wage policy and public sector employment policies, considering that, and probably I don't need to motivate that much on the fact that private and public sector employment decision work under different in different dimensions. So with the determinants of private sector employment decisions are quite different from public sector employment decisions, and this actually would have an impact in the labor market. So the question of our paper is, to what extent does the existence of a public sector employer affect the impact of the minimum wage in the labor market? And we address this question by developing a search and matching model with private and public sector employers, a minimum wage policy, and endogenous human capital decisions. And we structurally estimate the model with Chilean data and perform counterfactual and policy experiments. Let me go to the description of how this paper relates to the literature. This paper relates to three streams of the literature: search models with private and public sector, a literature where all of you have made interesting contributions. Second, the minimum wage in search models literature. There's a large literature on this. And third, the structural estimation of search model. Let me go to the main ingredients of our model. So in our model, we have heterogeneous workers, as Pedro anticipated, and those workers, before entering into the labor market, they have to make education decisions. Those decisions are determined by education costs. Education costs are distributed according to that distribution T, which you see in the first row of this slide. And the education decision before entering the labor market is sequential. So first, it's like workers decide on the first education level, and then they go to the next education level, and they stop where they find that given their education costs, it's not worthwhile to incur the education cost to go to upgrade their education level. After those education decisions are taken, workers are basically segmented by type, and they are allocated to different labor markets. That is, we are not assuming there are no transitions across workers group in our model. So the education decision is a one-time irrevocable decision. So markets are segmented by worker type, basically, and within each market, we have that the search process is random. There's no on-the-job search. There are two sectors, private and public sectors, and the productivity is heterogeneous in the sense that there is a match specific productivity assumption by which when two parties meet, a match specific productivity draw is realized from this distribution G. And then depending on this productivity draw, it might be in the interest of the parties or not to produce and to go on. So in terms of how we introduce search frictions, this is quite standard, as in these standard search and matching models of the labor market. For private sector vacancies, we assume that they are determined by the standard free entry condition. And in terms of government vacancies, we assume that the government targets an employment goal, and that's how the vacancies for public sector jobs are determined in our model. And job destruction is exogenous in both sectors. Let me give you a little bit more details on the main elements of our model. These are the main objects we have, the value functions, dependent on the different states of workers and firms. The measure of workers in the different states is given by this. This described in this second column. Kappa is the fraction of workers of type H in the population. U is the fraction if the number of unemployed workers. There's a unit mass of workers in our model. EP and EG are private and public sector employment. The contact rates are denoted by alpha P and alpha G in the private and in the public sector. Since matching is random, the contact rates for private sector jobs depend not only on the matching function but also on the sector composition of vacancies. So phi is the fraction of vacancies that come from the private sector. Let me highlight then in the last column. Let me highlight the policy instruments which are relevant in our framework. M is the minimum wage. X under bar represents a hiring rule in the public sector. I will talk about in a minute. And lambda and mu and are parameters related to the wage policy in the public sector. I will describe later in a minute as well. Let me go to the next slide.
Can I ask something?
I'll talk a little bit about hiring rules in both sectors. In our data, the minimum wage seems to be binding for both skilled and unskilled workers. And for that reason, the relevant hiring rule in our private sector in our model is the minimum wage. If the minimum wage were not binding, then that variable X are, yes?
I think Ioannis had a quick question.
Awesome, thanks. Feel free to if you're going to show that later, but are you going to show us how the productivity of workers is reflected in the output of the match in each sector? How that age affects how much is produced in public and private?
Yeah, it is in the model. If I'm taking you correctly, yeah, I can show you how wages are determined, and maybe you might find and see how productivity is related to wages and how how they work in this model. So
yeah, just let me Lucas, let me just complement your answer there. At the end, the aggregate output of the economy is going to be some aggregation of the composition of workers between H and private and public sector. So once this X productivity are realized, I mean, it's gonna of course the total output is gonna depend on the composition public sector, private sector, and also on H and the educational composition. I don't know if that's what you're trying to.
Very close. I'm just wondering if you have the same worker in public and private, do they produce the same output?
Yeah. The actual productivity is the same for both. The technology is the same. Yeah.
Excellent. And it's reflected on H in the same way. H is reflected in both sectors in the same way, the same production function. Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry, Lucas.
Yeah. That's about the hybrid rule in the private sector. In the public sector, we consider like a hybrid rule which is public sector specific and which is described by X under bar. And this is actually going to be an ingredient that we're going to obtain in the structural estimation part of our model. In terms of vacancy creation, there isn't anything interesting. I've just mentioned that there is a free entry condition for private sector vacancies and the assumption that the public sector vacancies are set to target an employment level. Let me go to the next slide. Perhaps I thought that this might actually give you, Ioannis, some elements on how productivity enters into our model and how relevant it is. So these affect wages. I mentioned before that when two parties realize a productivity draw is realized, and that actually could lead or not to a match to be formed. Wages are determined by Nash bargaining in the private sector, but there is a minimum wage. We have to take that into consideration. And so depending on the productivity draw, if that productivity draw is below the minimum wage, then the match is not formed at all, and the parties continue on their search process. But if productivity is between M and this value X squirrel, then the worker is going to be paid the minimum wage. What X squirrel is? X squirrel is a productivity level such that the Nash bargain wage is exactly equal to the minimum wage. That means that if the productivity draw is above X squirrel P, then the wage is determined by Nash bargaining, right? So I'm saying this because then given the data, you might be able to recover under these assumptions and other elements of the model, the productivity distribution in the private sector, and we can do the same in the public sector. But I have to add that in the public sector, we assume as in the similar spirit as in Gomes, a paper by Pedro, that the public sector wages pay a premium over the private sector wages, and that premium fee, as you see there, has two components. One component which is lambda, which is a pure public sector premium, and another component that is actually allows to put different weights on how productivity affect wages in the public sector for different types of workers of different productivity levels there. And so as a result, we have a wage schedule in the public sector, which in a way is kind of similar or reads in a similar way as the one I've just mentioned for the private sector. So if productivity is below X under bar, there's no match formation at all. For productivity levels between X under bar and X squirrel G, the worker is paid the minimum wage, and otherwise the worker is paid this Nash, modified Nash bargain wage in the public sector. And let me now go straight to the description of the sample we use for structural estimation. We use data from a standard, very much used survey in Chile, which is the Kuehn survey. And from there we get information on wages, durations, and stage in the labor market, and we also have information from the social protection survey, from which we compute the transition probabilities from unemployment to the different sectors. Our sample is actually set in order to consider workers who are more likely to be structurally affected in the labor market. So that we consider a sample of male workers between 25 and 55 years old, living in urban areas and with the contract. We tried these different sample assumptions and the results are not changed significantly. And let me just describe the data. I'll show you the data, the descriptive statistics of our model in the next slide. And what we find is that we have patterns that are very similar to those arising in other labor markets. First, as expected, skilled workers earn higher wages than unskilled workers. In terms of the public sector wage premium, we find that it's present. It's evident for unskilled workers, but for skilled workers, there is a negative public sector wage premium. Unemployment durations are longer for skilled workers, reflecting the better skill composition of the workers in the public sector. We find that the transitions from unemployment to public sector jobs are higher among skilled workers, as you see there. And finally, as I mentioned before, well, the minimum wage is binding in both sectors, but only a very, very low fraction of workers earn the minimum wage among skilled workers. But among unskilled workers, and as expected, there is a much larger fraction of workers earning the minimum wage in both the private and in the public sector. And let me stop here and pass on to Mauricio.
You're muted.
Oh, thank you. Sorry. Now you can hear me.
Okay.
So let me talk about how we estimate the model. As you already see, the model has some assumptions about how the public sector is modeled here. One is the hiring rule, which is exogenous, and the wage schedule, which has some components. And we do not model the decision-making process of the government. So we try to recover these essential parameters from the data. So we try to put together some credible identification strategy for these parameters, given the structure of the model. So we divided the estimation strategy in 4 steps. The first step is the main step, is due by likelihood. We estimate basically with the supply side of the data. We took together, we assume that the nice thing of this model is that the only component that links the supply and the demand side are these arrival rates alphas. So we assume that these alphas are parameters to be estimated. And then we use this estimated parameter to recover the demand side. So we did it by likelihood, all the supply side of the data, and of course it depends on if the minimum wage is binding or not, and given the type of worker, we estimate one on another model, and we let the likelihood to decide which of these 2 models to estimate. And then, as I said, given that we can decouple the model in 2, these alphas are used with the equilibrium conditions to recover the whole part, the whole part of the demand side of the model. The only thing we need is, as in Flynn 2006. The only thing that we need is the matching function, to know the matching function. If we know the matching function, we can recover everything. Even the vacancies of the government. So because we don't have data on vacancies, and unfortunately we did some assumption about the matching function. So given these 2 estimations, the third step is to compute the distribution of the pre-labor market human capital decisions. And the only thing that we need here is that the decision of investing in human capital is comparing the return of going to labor age versus the cost of acquiring that education. And the return of going to labor market age is basically the value of unemployment, because if you go, the decision of going to the age market is basically that you are allowed to search in that market. So comparing this U that is estimated here and the cost, we can recover the distribution. The only thing that we need is one parameter distribution. Now, how many age do we have? In a fourth step, we simulate of these models and recover the aggregated distribution of wages, and then we keep the model with the age that fits best the aggregated wage distribution. So and we left with two groups. So in terms of the identification, we follow two standard strategies. One is Flynn and Ekman 82, and the other one is Flynn 2006. So in terms of Flynn and Ekman, the durations and transitions, the duration of unemployment give us information about the hazard rate out of unemployment, and then the transitions give us information about where these guys go from unemployment, if they go to private sector or public sector. And then the steady state condition give us information about the termination rate. That's how more or less the identification works in terms of the unemployment state. In terms of the productivity distribution, here is where we do this strategy. We have observed wages in public and public sectors. So in terms of information, we have the location of the scale of the accepted wages distribution, and we have the proportion of people earning the minimum wage. We have these three main sources of information. So if in the private sector, we assume log normality for G, this is a distribution that is common in the literature, we can recover from them using this idea of we have wages, we have to map into productivity using the wages distribution, and then recover from the truncated productivity distribution, the original distribution. So given that, we can recover G using the location, the scale of G, using information of the location and the scale of the wages distribution, and then we can recover U from the people earning the minimum wage. And then we can go to the public sector wages to recover the parameters of the wages distribution, given that we know G. And here's where the assumption of the same technology plays. So if we assume that the same technology plays between these two sectors, so we have the location and the scale and the proportion of people earning the minimum wage in the public sector, and we can recover all the parameters of the public sector. That's here, the Hayen rule, and then the lambda and the nu. Finally, as I said, we need one parameter distribution so we can recover this distribution from the proportion of people in each of these age sectors. So this is just an overview of
one question. I think everything was pretty clear. So on the separation rate, so the separation rates are the ones that adjust so you can match the unemployment durations and
the steady state
and the steady state
condition.
Okay.
Exactly.
And okay, yeah, go on. Yeah.
Okay.
Another thing. So you said you need to, first is clarification. So you need to parameterize the matching function. And out of curiosity, which one do you use? Which matching function?
Cap Douglas.
Okay, very good.
And then we use an elasticity estimated from the Chilean labor market for the Cap Douglas distribution. Another way to go is to assume a matching function without an unknown parameter, like the exponential one. But the thing is that the fit of the exponential one is not that good. The Cap Douglas is better. So in terms of the results, I don't know how much time I have, but let me just highlight a couple of things. Jobs arrive more often to.
You have 8 minutes until the.
Okay.
Until it's 3:45.
Okay. Jobs arrive more often to the private sector than the public sector, and that's in part related with the size of the number of vacancies in both of these jobs. As expected, in terms of unskilled workers, jobs in the private sector terminates more often than in the public sector. So the public sector job for unskilled are more or less more stable than private sector jobs. These two guys talk about the productivity distribution. Let me just say that the productivity is higher for high-skilled workers than the private sector. This is the unconditional expected value given the log normality assumption. In terms of the hiring rule of the public sector, as you see, the hiring rule in the private sector is the minimum wage, which is 1.7 in the model, and in the public sector is 1.2 and 1. So the public sector is less pickier when hiring workers in this market. In terms of the premium, as you see, the pure premium is positive for unskilled workers and doesn't exist for high-skilled workers. And then again, the premium, because it was with negative in the distribution, again, the premium that depends on the productivity is also positive for low-skilled workers. And for high-skilled workers, even plays the other way around. So we find a strong premium for unskilled workers in the public sector. This is what I want to highlight here. Yeah.
A quick question: the 0.000, was it the corner that you restricted the parameter, but could in principle be negative, or were you just?
No, yeah. It could be negative. Could be negative.
And it just went to 0.
Yeah, it's 0.0. I mean, it's in the 6 or 7, but yeah. No, it could be. We do not restrict lambda. It could be negative in principle. We try to give the data a chance in that sense. Okay, this is the fit of the wages distribution. I think we do more or less well, given that we have just 2 educational groups, and this is the aggregated distribution for private and public sectors. Okay, let me go to the main part of the paper. This question about if the public sector buffers the minimum wage, and then give you the answer right now, and the answer is yes. It buffers the effect of minimum wage. And how we do it? The thing is that we have an economy. We have an economy with public sector, so we can do this policy experiments of increasing the minimum wage. And we increase the minimum wage. We decrease and increase the minimum wage. The minimum wage here is $1.7 per hour, and we go from 0.5 to 3, and then we ask if the economy with public sector, given this increase in minimum wage, acts in the same way as an economy without a public sector. That's the first question. And the second question is, okay, let's have a public sector and compare the public sector without public sector, but in an economy in which the hiring rule is the same in the private and the public sector. So we close this mechanism of the hiring rule. And at the end, we compare an economy with public and without public sector, but with the same wage schedule. So we did all these 3 things to see how these 2 things play out. So let me give you the results. Here we have the effects of unemployment, on unemployed. This is the minimum wage. And then here in this axis, we present the ratio between, in this case, the unemployment rate in an economy with public sector versus an economy without public sector. Always public sector versus without public sector with the different assumptions. The red one is the benchmark, the public sector with all the ingredients versus without public sector. The blue one is the with public sector, but with same hiring rules as in private sector versus no public sector. And then the green one is public sector versus no public sector, but with the same wages, right? And in all the graphs, we're gonna see these 3 lines: the red, the blue, and the green one. So as you can see, the red line is always below 1. So the unemployment rate in an economy with public sector is lower than in an economy without public sector. So the public sector is hiring more people than the private sector in the counterfactual or no public sector with just 1. And then as you see, as the minimum wage increases, right? This effect is even bigger. The unemployment rate is even lower in an economy with public sector, right? And this is exactly the buffer effect, right? The public sector is not only counter-attacking to the minimum wage policy in terms of unemployment rate, but it's going further and reducing the unemployment rate. And how these two components play out, hiring rules and wage schedule. Hiring rules are very important here because reduce the frictions of the market. As you see, if we drop the hiring rules, the buffer effect is considerably reduced as the minimum wage goes up. In terms of the wage schedules, as you see, they work in the opposite direction because when you increase the minimum wage, right? What the wage schedules do is actually working through the value of unemployment, making people starting being more time in unemployment, waiting for a public sector vacancy to come up, right? So this effect of the hiring rule, the fact that the government is reducing the frictions, given that it's less picky in hiring workers, is the main result behind the buffer effect. And in terms of duration, we have more or less the same results, but as you see, the scale the effect is very low. In terms of employment and minimum wage incidence, as you see, when you have public sector employment again, the incidence of the minimum wage is lower than the incidence in an economy without public sector. In terms of the incidence, I'm talking about the proportion of people earning the minimum wage. As you see, of course, as the minimum wage goes up, many people start to earn the minimum wage, and this effect starts to disappear, right? They start to disappear. In terms of productivity and total welfare, and this is important, in terms of the welfare, as you can see here, welfare is always better in an economy with public sector, and that's basically because of the unskilled workers. They go from unemployment to employment much faster, and the unemployment rate is lower. Our measure of welfare is just the aggregation of all the values in this economy. And of course, if you aggregate all the values, you have lower unemployment and higher employment. Of course, you're going to have more welfare. But the counterpart of this result is the productivity result. And in terms of productivity, the productivity in the private sector is lower when we have public sector. So you have these two parts of the story. Welfare is higher, but the productivity in private sector is worse. Moreover, because we have here endogenous human capital decision, when we have public sector, we have worse composition of the labor force in terms of unskilled and skilled. We have more proportion of unskilled workers than skilled workers, and that's because the public sector, as you saw, have a premium. The public sector is less picky, so the value of being in this particular category of being unskilled is higher. So people start to stay in the unskilled part of the market. So you have these two opposite results in terms of welfare productivity and skill composition. So let me conclude saying that we have a model here. Yes.
On the result on productivity, is it because the government hires asymmetrically more skilled workers?
Yes.
Then
yes.
it's on you count the average productivity, so that so it's both that and then the
it's composition,
the cutoff within on the okay, yeah.
Okay. So we have a model here, as a standard DMP model with 3 components: public sector and public sector, minimum wage, and endogenous human capital. We structurally estimate the model using data on Chile. We tried to have a more or less clean identification strategy of the main parameter of the public sector, because we know that people start to complain when you do some assumption about public sector behaves. In terms of estimation, the estimations indicate that workers meet private sector vacancies more frequently. Public sector premium favors more unskilled workers, and higher standards are less restricted in the public sector. That's the 3 main takeaways from the estimation. And then from this policy and counterfactual experiments, the main takeaways are basically 2. A less restrictive hiring rule is the main driver of the buffer effect, in which quality acts in the other direction. We have a good effect, or a positive effect on welfare, but a negative on productivity and composition of the labor force. So these are the 2. I think the takeaways of the paper. I don't know if we have a question. We can go on more details if you want. We have more slides there. We can discuss it. Thank you very much again, Pedro. Thank you very much for inviting us and to organize this.
No, thank you for the presentation. Is there any question? We then can also use the coffee break to ask more informally. Does anyone have a specific question now? So because we are 3 minutes past the time, so I think we can move on. But yeah, thank you. So I don't know who's presenting. Is it Thanasis or Ioannis?
No, I'll present. So you're making me a co-host, so I can. Oh, okay,
yeah,
excellent.
You can already share screen. Yeah.
Very good. Thank you. Okay, so this works, right? It should be.
Yeah, we can hear you and you can see. Yeah.
Very good. So one more time, Pedro, thanks very much. That's super exciting. Thanks for putting the workshop together. Thanks for pushing the agenda. So that was a very nice presentation, and I also look forward to the next ones. We're in very similar grounds here. We're taking a tiny bit more of a structural approach, and we're focusing more on trying to evaluate how important that idea is that was also present in Lucas's and Mauricio's paper, the idea that the public employs skilled workers, okay? And by employing these skilled workers, these talented people, it takes them away from the private sector. So this is what actually, and want to understand the effects of that. So, So again, the standard thing, we already know that the public sector is important, a very large employer, okay? So very quickly over that. Now, what is important for our argument is that, as we said, in many countries, and Pedro showed us that on the data earlier about Greece, Cyprus, Portugal, Italy, the standard European countries, but also in many other countries. I mean, it's not a US phenomenon, but in Brazil, in India, in Mexico, and many other countries, there is an important wage premium for being a public sector employee. And also something else standard about public sector jobs, they're usually very safe. They very often come with full job security. So what we're trying to say here is that, okay, these jobs are very, very attractive. And because they're very attractive, they attract good workers from the economy. Now, we focus on meritocratic hiring in the sense that if the public sector really employs the best workers that apply for these jobs, then the good workers have the incentive to apply as well. Okay, so not only these jobs are good, but good workers know that if they apply for them, they're going to take them. So actually, the public sector is a big attractor of talent in the economy. Okay, now we're gonna a few more pieces of evidence. We're going to write down a model and calibrate it to Greece. So it's important to convince you that Greece is a good laboratory for that experiment, okay? So Pedro, again, already showed us evidence about the substantial wage premium for public sector employees in Greece, okay? It's actually, according to the data, it seemed to be the highest, Greece had the highest difference between public and private sector wages. Not only that, meritocratic in public sector hiring, Greece is actually meritocratic. So we want to claim that the public sector does indeed choose the best employees. So there are two main ways to become a public employee in Greece. You can take an exam that all of us take at the end of the high school, and you can say that you really want to go and study in some departments that provide the public with some specific employees. Okay, if you want to become a police officer, a firefighter, if you want to be in the army, all of these are public sector jobs. You need to study one of those departments, and you do that if you do well in the exam at the end of high school. Now, if we look at that, what we see is that the public sector schools, the schools that prepare people to become public employees, are very, very popular among good students. Okay, so here I'm giving you some cutoffs that indicate the quality of students that apply and go to these schools. So the higher is the cutoff, that means the best, the higher is the quality of students that go there. It's very high. So this 18.4 and 18.3 is out of 20, meaning that really top students go and become, police officers. They are in the army and firefighters, okay? As a comparison, the best engineering school, to go to the best engineering school, you need to have a score over 18.3. The cutoff to become a firefighter was higher, okay? So again, to show you that talented people wanna go to the public sector. Another comparison that we it makes us sad, but it's also indicative, is that if you want to become an economist and study in the best department, you just need to be an average student. You just need to have a cutoff over 15.8. But to be a military economist, because the military does employ some economists, you need to be a stellar student. Okay, so what do we get out of these stats? That some of the students in Greece won't go and become, military personnel. Now, the other way to become a public employee is to take an exam. And that's by far, the most common way across public sectors all over the world. There is a civil personnel selection exams that, says, look, there are these jobs. People go and take the exam. The best applicants are indeed selected. The best, people with the highest scores are selected. Now, to see how popular these jobs are in Greece, get these numbers. In the decade from 94 to 2004, there were 85,000 public positions that, the personnel selection office said, the public wants to hire these people. Over 500,000 people, 1,500,000 people participated in the exams. Okay. Of course, some of these people took the exam multiple times for sure, but just to evaluate how much people want to become public employees. Okay. And again, something similar for economists. The National Bank of Greece, which is a public organization, announced 800 positions. For these 800 positions in 2004, 90,000 people participated in the exam. Okay. Now, so Greece seems that these jobs are, very good opportunities, and people want to get them. So what we want to do, we want to evaluate that, the macroeconomic implications of that absorption of talent. Okay. And we're going to do it in a simple and straightforward way. So how we're going to do it, we want to write down a version of the Pissarides model, which has segmented labor markets, okay? Which means that in order to work for the public, you need to go and prepare for one of these exams. And because these jobs are, really good and workers want to go and do them, and hiring is meritocratic, means that good workers are going to go after for these jobs, so they're not going to be in the pool of private sector employees. And because they're not going to be in the pool of private sector employees, firms are going to take that into account when they create jobs. They take into account that they face a worse pool of workers, they create less jobs. These jobs feature lower productivity and a lower production, and we want to tell you how large these losses are. How we're going to tell you that? We're going to take that model with these basic characteristics, and we're going to do a bunch of counterfactuals. Okay, after, of course, we calibrate it for the Greek economy. The counterfactuals are going to be some standard reforms of making the public sector smaller or lowering the public sector wage premium. And we're going to compare the variables post and after the reforms to have a sense of how big the losses are. Okay. Okay, so this seems we're on the same page. We find that this mechanism is significantly quantitatively important. Okay, so here are the reforms we do. We cut down public jobs. We say that, let's say, hiring, instead of being meritocratic and the government choosing the best, let's say that it chooses pretty much, a random sample of the workers, or let's say that the wage premium becomes very small. we see that in those reforms, macroeconomic aggregates improve by a lot, okay? There are substantial gains in GDP, unemployment in the private sector drops, productivity and wages in the private sector also improve, okay? So I'm gonna, final thing also very quickly to tie it with Pedro's, of course, we don't want to say that the public, governments in the world should not hire meritocratically. Of course they should, okay? What we're trying to say is that meritocratic hiring together with a very, very generous public sector may lead to misallocation. And we're trying to tell you that how large these misallocation losses are, okay? Another cautionary note, we're not thinking about top-level public officials here, okay? Of course, hospitals need managers, and these managers need to be of top quality, no question about it. We have some particular public, employees in mind. We're talking about the large mass of average and low, skilled level positions, okay? People who work in tax authorities, in postal services, in public utility companies, and do the everyday operations. This is, what we're thinking about. We're not thinking again about top level officials. So since we're also in the process of revising the paper, we want to take that a bit more seriously. So we're now we're revising the paper, trying to, in some sense, have different types of jobs that are have high skill demands and low skill demands, and model and formalize that idea. We're not there yet. Today I'm going to show you a model with only one type of jobs, but pretty much this is where we're going. So if any comments you may have regarding that underemployment aspect of, the public not only taking talented workers, but the public taking talented workers and making them do ultra simple, not super productive tasks, please let me know. Again, I'm going to talk about it a bit in the end. Very quickly, so this is the literature slide we have. So definitely we're going to update it after the talk. It was only Lucas's and Mauricio's papers that we knew before that, so we have it here. But definitely we're going to put together with the other classics that I'm pretty sure all of you know. Or of course we're going to put your work. We'll be happy to do it. So no questions, so I'm just gonna go straight to the math. Hopefully that was clear. So again, it's a simple variant of the Pissarides model, okay, with a couple of characteristics that are not standard. So one of the things we wanna do is, again, we wanna have some workers that are talented and some workers that are not that talented. What Pedro said earlier, that our paper is about this unobserved heterogeneity in terms of productivity, okay? Now, we're gonna have two sectors, the public sector and the private sector. And just to remember, the variables you'll see and value functions that have that squiggle here, these are going to be our public sector variables, okay? Now, how is this worker productivity reflected in the output of the match, okay? It's 100% in the private sector. So when a firm employs a worker with a productivity P, and there is of course a distribution F of P of these people out there, this is going to be 100% reflected in the output of the match. The output of the match is going to be the productivity of the work. Now, we're also going to assume that when the same person is employed by the public, there's going to be a discount in their productivity. Okay, we're going to assume that the output of the match, the output of the same person in public is not P, is going to be this alpha times P, and that alpha is less than 1, capturing a bunch of stories we can think of. The first that comes to mind is, again, people in the public usually are not evaluated based on performance criteria. The incentive structures are very loose. Greece is a case in point. We can tell, we can give many references that say that the incentive and payment schemes and structure in Greek public sector are very inefficient. So people do not have the same incentives to perform in these two sectors. Okay, this is, and among other things that we want to capture with that alpha P. The private sector matching is pretty standard. Firms can enter by paying a standard entry cost, and there is one firm and one vacancy, okay? And of course, we're gonna have free entry pinning down the measure of vacancies created. How are wages determined? In private sector, we're gonna have NAS bargaining, so the wage is gonna be that WP. What we wanna say here is that with that NAS bargaining, the productivity of the worker is going to be reflected in their wage, okay? While that's not true in the public. In the public, the wage is going to be a policy variable. It's going to be that W squiggle here, which is chosen by the government. It has nothing to do with workers' productivity. Again, we're being consistent in that lack of incentives to perform and how these incentives are not reflected in public sector wages. And importantly, how these wages are going to be paid for, we're going to assume that the government imposes a tax. Okay, we're going to assume that to finance these wages, the government needs to impose a tax, and given that tax, they can pay pretty much any wage W they wish. Okay, of course, in our calibration, we're going to take that from the data, and I'll tell you how. But again, this is going to be financed by a taxation choice that the government imposes on private sector masses. Okay. Some other standard model assumptions. There is an exit probability for workers. Workers retire with probability delta. And of course, to keep the model stationary, there is a mass of workers replacing these people who retire. And another important difference between public and private, we also want to capture, is that in private sector, people lose their jobs, okay? They lose some jobs without exogenous destruction rate lambda. There is no destruction in public sector, okay? Again, we are all familiar, I guess, with that, but the idea in Greece is very striking because it's written in the constitution that public jobs, it's illegal to fire public employees. So you can keep that job as long as you're employed. As long as you're in the labor market, you're not retired. The matching in the private sector is very standard, but again, here we have already, said something. We've assumed something that there is not going to be any crowding out between the public and the private. And what do I mean by that? In that the private sector, there is going to be this matching function M, which has as arguments the unemployed looking for these private sector jobs and a measure of vacancies, and these are only the private sector vacancies. So we're not going to do what Lucas and Mauricio showed us earlier, that there is this congestion between these sectors. We abstract from that. And after that, it's standard. This is a constant return to scale matching function. There is a probability for a firm to fill its vacancy, which depends on the tightness, the ratio of vacancies over unemployed, and there is a corresponding probability to find the job for workers. The matching in the public sector is very simple, close to what was shown earlier. We assume there is a mass of public sector jobs, which again, we're going to take from the data. The public sector wants to have new jobs filled. Okay, that new is exogenous. How they're going to fill them, they see how, which workers are applying. They're going to do it meritocratically because again, we're modeling an exam in which the best workers are chosen. And what they're going to say is that from the applicants, of the pool of applicants we see, we choose the best types such that the mass of these types is equal to mu. Okay, very simple. It's very meritocratic, no frictions, just choose the best. Notice, and this is something we're thinking about changing, if we had frictions in the public sector, this would only make our results stronger. Okay, we would say not only they take the good people, but these good people do not become employed right away. As a result, there are even greater losses in the workings of that public sector. Here we're saying, let's say they're very, very good and that hiring happens very, very fast. So the only losses are because they attract good workers who are not available in the pool of private. There are no losses because they take time to make these people employed. So what we're going to assume is that if you are chosen in the public, you take you need 1 period to take the exam, and after 2 periods, you're going to be employed forever. Now, this is here where how straightforward that hiring process is helps us a lot, because in equilibrium, everybody knows that there's going to be a subset of worker productivities are going to be in the public sector, that the public sector is going to hire from. This is our P squiggle here. Okay, so this is the subset of types that actually in equilibrium are going to be hired by the public sector. People who are more productive are not going to bother to apply. They're going to go to the private. People who are less productive than the lowest worker that's going to be accepted, they would love to work in the public, but they're not going to be accepted. Why? Because there is a substantial mass that are better of them that have already applied and covering this.
Ioannis, a quick question, sorry. So PH is in a way determined by alpha and the wage policy in the public sector?
It's going to be determined. it's going to be determined by an indifference condition of the best worker who wants to go in the public. I'll show you that very explicitly.
But both elements, I think, are important, right? This alpha assumption that the productivity in the public sector is a fraction of private sector productivity, I think, plays a role, right? Together with the wage.
It definitely plays a role, but not for that thing, because what this person is going to be thinking is what I'm going to get in the private and what I'm going to get in the public, and the wage in the public is independent, is an exogenous variable.
Oh, I see.
It doesn't have to do with their productivity. It's a policy variable that those wages are going to be, the government's going to choose taxes to pay for them. So you're right that it's important for some results at the end, but not for that specific thing.
Oh, thank you.
Very good. No, good clarification. So this is very standard. So, okay, let me show you the value functions so Pedro, I have 13 more minutes. I'm already, how much? 10 more minutes. Sorry, you're muted, I think. Okay, I'm going to keep going, but if I run out of, because I couldn't hear
sorry,
you.
I was muted. Yeah, 13 minutes. Yeah.
13 minutes. Excellent. Okay, I think I'm good. So this again is very standard. If you're a worker working in the private sector, your productivity is P. You're going to be getting that wage W, which is going to be determined from NAS bargaining, and to show that this is going to be dependent on your productivity, that's the reason we say it's a W with subscript P. And next period, given that you do not exit that market, if you're not hit by the job separation shock, you're going to be still employed. And if you're hit, you need to go back to unemployment. Okay. And also you're going to be an unemployed worker with productivity P. Now, if you're employed in the public, you're just going to be enjoying that productivity, your wage that has nothing to do with your productivity. And next period, you're going to be employed for sure. You're going to lose that only if you're hit by delta and you leave the labor market. So as you see, our value of being employed in the public is just a constant. Okay, it's the discounted sum of all these future wages. Okay, that's not super important. That the fact that it's constant, we could have it reacting to workers' productivity. We just need to have that this response of the wages on workers' productivity is stronger in the private than it is in the public. Okay, still, if it was a positive function, but with a smaller slope, everything would go through. Okay, a bit more meat on the unemployment. Now, if you are an unemployed worker who has not chosen a sector, this is your value. Okay, this is what we mean by that hat here. You are going to get unemployment benefits, and next period you need to choose. Okay, so this is an assumption that it's very important. Again, workers need to specialize in the type of search they do. And again, what we're thinking here is that if you're going to be serious about getting into the public, you need to take the exam. So you need to devote your resources into that instead of looking for jobs in the private. Okay, so you're going to choose what's the best for you. What are the differences if you're in the private? The problem, if you are on the private, that U of P is very standard. With some probability you become employed. With the complement of that probability, you're still going to be unemployed. If you decide to go to the public, it's slightly different. For one period, you have to stay unemployed. That's our assumption. You take the exam and you're being screened for a period. And after that, if your type is good enough to be hired, you're going to be employed in the public sector forever. And this is the only thing we're going to see in equilibrium. If your type were not good enough to be hired in the public, then you would go back to unemployment. But again, in equilibrium, in this perfect four-side simple model, this branch is not going to be observed. The only people who go to the public are the people that they know that their type is going to be good enough to be hired. Okay. And again, one other thing, if we change that and we say there is some imperfection in what people are not sure, and some other types are going to try for the public, again, this only is going to make our results stronger, because we're going to have some types, again, not being in the private and being in the public, and at the end, it didn't worth their time, which by the way, happens a lot in reality. Firm's value functions are very, very standard. This is entry, and to enter, you need to pay that cost, and with some probability, you're going to fill that vacancy. And after that, because it's random search, the returns of having a filled vacancy depend on the average worker you're going to meet, and who are the workers you're meeting are all these types that are not going to the public. This is, again, the composition that the private firms face in there. And if you have filled the vacancy, then what is being produced? This is our simple production function. The worker in the output produces their productivity, okay? And they're getting paid, the firms have to pay them their wage, and also, you know, the matches have to pay a tax down. Okay, now, we also saw in the paper that if you have a richer production function, which takes the public sector output as an input, like a Barrow production function, that here, instead of only having the private workers' productivity, you also have an average of the public sector output, our results still go through. Okay, they are a bit smaller in magnitude, but all our counterfactuals show substantive gains for the reforms. Okay. Okay, so that's not too important for now. Okay, here, let me show you, again, this is what I think Lucas was asking. So how are people think? So the red line is the value of unemployment, okay? The value of being unemployed in the private sector, excuse me. So if you're unemployed in the private sector, there is a very clear positive relationship between your productivity and the value of being unemployed, because this is gonna be reflected in your wage. The value of looking for a job in the public is a horizontal line. Again, why? Because the wages and the discounted sum of wages as a result are constant, does not depend on workers' productivity. So there's going to be this indifferent person PH, of which is indifferent which sector they want to go. All the workers with higher productivity are going to the private. These are, you know, COs, top-level managers, you know, surgeons and stuff like that. And this is going to be the most productive worker going to the public. Now,
Ioannis, can I ask a quick question about this graph?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, I was thinking in this idea that the government jobs last forever, right? So if I am a worker, and if I can get a job that lasts forever, maybe I want to go there always, right? So you need, in the model, you need higher wages, public sector employment wages what I'm trying to say is that if the blue one is below the red one, I mean, it's below, I don't know, in the parameterization, or it's too big, this always cross. I mean, the thing is that maybe the public sector could become an absorbent state. That's what I'm trying to say.
No. If the public sector is ultra generous, then that blue line would be higher, and if you would have even the most productive person in the economy becoming a public servant, and if the public sector, that blue line is very, very bad, you may have, you know, it would be so low that nobody would like to go there. That's absolutely true. But
okay, but the other way around doesn't work in the sense that everybody's going to want to go to the public sector. That doesn't happen in the model.
It doesn't because the blue line intersects at a point to the left of 2. Like, you know, you see it's not as high so that it can be fully over the red line. But even if it did, again, this is just the results from the calibration, but the argument all of the arguments would still go through, right? So
okay.
We can talk more about it, but I think you're onto something that, of course, it depends on the numbers we use. But still, you know, given how generous the public sector jobs are, we kind of expect it to this intersection to happen in, like, you know, pretty high, like at a relatively good time. That's, I guess.
Okay. Okay, go ahead. Thank you.
Ioannis, 4 minutes about?
I'm going fast. Oh, internalize that. So very last thing about the model, I'll show you the counterfactuals after that, is that, oops, sorry. So here is the wages, and again, the wages are increasing in terms of productivity in the private sector, again, capturing that thing. And this blue thingy here are the wages in the public, okay? So again, what happens, this PH is the indifferent person, indifferent between the two sectors. And after that, how the public hires, the public says, I'm gonna hire that many people to cover these new jobs I want. So I'm gonna hire that subset of types such that the mass of these types cover these jobs. All of these people take the same wage, okay? And as you can see here, we capture one of the things that Pedro has written about, and the previous paper also was showing. The very productive people lose in some sense in terms of wages, okay? Again, they're willing to go to the public because these are very safe jobs, but they kind of sacrifice wages they would get in the private. However, that's not true for the lower, workers that are not that productive in the private. As you can see, for that neighborhood of people here, these people have wage gains. Okay, so even though we do not have a clear definition of skill, skilled or unskilled jobs in the model, we do capture that stylized fact that the more productive people, presumably in better jobs, work in public with a wage loss, and the less productive people that work in the public, they do that with a wage gain. Okay, so very quickly about our sorry about that, just so you some of our counterfactuals, okay, and to make sure that I show you some results. Let's say we do the counterfactual after a calibration that the government lowers the number of public employees by 20%. We see substantial improvement in macro aggregates, okay? Taxes drop by 25%, productivity in the private sector improves, wages improve. Importantly, also unemployment drops, okay? So what I wanna highlight from that is the following. The government employs 20% less people. These people become unemployed in the private sector. So we have a huge spike in the mass of unemployed in that model. Okay, this is in some sense what we're afraid when we're worried about austerity measures, and for good reason. However, the model says, look, even if all these people go to the private sector to look for jobs, the response of the firms is so aggressive, they create so many more jobs that actually unemployment drops, okay? So that's one, again, it shows that that channel, the response of private firms to the quality of the pool they face, okay, is strong. Even when the private sector labor market is, full with new unemployed, firms still employ them because their average productivity is higher, so it's worth it for the firms to do, together with a drop in taxes. Okay, so it really becomes working in the private sector better. Another reform is to say, okay, let's say that government hires, instead of hiring the best workers, the government says, I'm gonna hire a representative subset of all worker types, okay, what we call random hiring. Then what we see is that taxes have to increase, okay? So the government needs to tax more to finance the same number of people because these people are less productive, and this is reflected in the quality of the services and the tax revenue that the government has to collect. They have to collect more taxes because now the quality of public services is lower. However, notice, even with higher taxes, the response of the private sector is still strong. Productivity improves, wages improve, unemployment drops by almost 5%. Okay, so again, even in the case that the government has to tax more, the private sector improves so much that the job creation and wages still improve. And finally, what we think is the best exercise we do in the sense that it makes our mechanism, it really shows what it's doing. It's we say, let's keep employment in the public sector fixed, same number of people, no losses. Okay, let's get away from that austerity rhetoric. Let's just lower the wages, keeping the number of public employees fixed. Then still we get massive gains, okay, through especially lower taxes, okay, because again, they do not have to pay these high wages, so they tax less. At the same time, the good types do not go that much to the public because the gains are not that much, so they go to the private. And these two forces, lower taxes and better, the private workers pool for firms, makes productivity, wages, and improvement unemployment drop by 7%. Okay, that's our mechanism. Leave the quality and quantity of public sector fixed, just lower their wages. Okay, massive gains. So the final thing I want to say is that, and just take a minute for that, is that, again, now we're working on the model to make it a bit sharper regarding that aspect of job heterogeneity. So we want to have high and low skilled jobs, okay? Because we want to have that idea that the public takes good people, not only puts them, not only absorbs them from the private, but they make them do less skilled stuff, like let's be in administration or protection, low skilled occupations, okay? So how we're going to do it, we're going to use the job polarization node for what are the high and low skilled jobs, very simple. And we're going to look at the data to see what are the occupations of people in the two sectors. Very quickly, very rough, view of the data has showed us that, for example, administrative jobs are pretty much 35% of public sector increase. Okay, that's a lot. It's like 3 times the administrative jobs in the private. This is where we want to go. Okay, what we want to show is whether actually what is going to be the response if the public attracts less productive people that are not being wasted in those tasks. Okay, this is what we want to go, which is again close to what Pedro is doing with Andrew in their working paper. They do it with respect to education. We want to do it more like in terms of occupation and speak formally to that idea of underemployment. I think there's a need to conclude. I've said everything. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ioannis. I had just two. So one of, I think your paper highlights one of the things when we talked about the microeconomics versus the macro. It clashes with this microeconomic view that's you want to pay high wages to attract the best workers to the public sector. And when you have a macroeconomic perspective, you know that if you get the best, they are not somewhere else. So this idea of always trying to get the best person for the job might not be the right person for the job, but here is where it clashes. And I do think when you separate the markets because you have an observable ability, but then there is an element that's observable when you have education. And that I think you will get some interesting results, because when you see that the very high wages that you pay to the unskilled workers just means that you'll be absorbing the best of them, but then they won't be in the private sector. So then the private sector creates fewer jobs because they expect the average worker to be lower. So you can probably have some. And the other thing I would probably emphasize, always do the exercises with and without the tax, because the tax is going to matter a lot. And I think that's one of the angles that you can push relative to all the other papers, including mine that I'll present, that we do, or Mauricio's, that we don't, and Lucas, because we don't have the tax rate per se as impacting the job creation. So you take it as reducing the value. So understanding what is the effect of just the tax and the budgetary aspect would be, is kind of good to disentangle the mechanisms.
Very good.
Okay, and we are running a bit after. We still have the 15-minute break to catch up after my presentation, but anyone has questions?
Before you start, just to confirm, so what we said that our extension having the high and low skill jobs, it seems that it was along the first comment you made that we're going to be able to be clearer about actually what are some observable characteristics of workers and jobs that actually this absorption happens. So I guess I take it to be in line with your comment. Or
yes, yeah, I think yeah. So I think it will, because you have the fact that at the top for the college workers the premium is much lower. So it's very different. You'll be talking about different things when you're talking about the meritocracy at the bottom or at the top.
Very good, thanks.
Cool. Okay, so can you see the slides? Okay, so so this is joint work with Zoe that just joined, and the title is "You're the One That I Want: Public Employment and Women Labor Market Outcome." So one of the facts about public employment is that there is this overrepresentation of women. So it's more important for women's labor markets. So you can do it when you can see it when you look at the public employment share out of total employment for women and for men. And you see it's always represents a larger fraction of employment for women, sometimes twice as high. So this is using microdata for the US, UK, France, and Spain. Another way to look at it, it's just look at out of total public employees, what's the fraction of women, and compare that to total private sector employment, and look what's the share of women, and we find the share of women in public employment is higher. And in these 4 countries, the majority of public sector workers are women. So our question is, why do women want to work in the public sector? And there is one natural explanation that you hear anecdotally, that women have an intrinsic preference for certain public sector occupations. So they want to be doctors, nurses, teachers, or they have a preference for occupations that bring on the common good. And now we want to understand and extract what is this intrinsic preference from what are different characteristics of public sector jobs that might be valued differently for men and women. And these relate to human resource practices. So one is that's been estimated in the literature that women have a lower gender wage gap in the public sector. Or in other words, the public sector wage premium is higher for women than for men. So in relative terms, it would be a stronger magnet for women than for men. A second possibility is better work-life balance. So fewer hours of work, but also more amenable hours, better childcare arrangements, sick leave, and this might attract, again, more women than men. And then finally, potentially the higher job security. So what we want to distinguish and quantify each of these magnets and how strong they are in attracting women to the public sector. So our view is that the selection of women, it's not that the government wants to hire more women than men. It's really about a self-selection. So the magnet of the public sector is stronger for women than for men. We start with an empirical section where we document differences in gender differences in public and private employment, but also in transition rates, in wages and in hours worked. And we have these 4 countries. So we go to microdata to get to draw these facts. And then we have a quantitative search and matching model where you have men and women that decide to enter the private or the public sector, and then within there is a 3-state labor market. So they also decide whether to participate in the labor market. So there is an option to be inactive. So in a sense, you have 2 times 2 times 3, and in a way it merges 3 papers. So one is the seminal paper by Garibaldi and Wasmer with a 3-state labor market, with a recent paper by Albanese and Sahim that has 3 states, but for men and women. But then we also feed in the public versus private. And we calibrate the model for these 4 countries. And we do 3 things. So first is try to decompose the women's selection into these 4 explanations. Then second, we use the model to calculate the public sector job security and work-life balance premia. So this is one thing that we can do with a structural model. We can ask a private sector worker, how much would you be willing to sacrifice of your wage to have the same job security as the public sector? How much would you sacrifice of your wage to have the same work-life balance as the public sector? So in a way, we can quantify, so put a monetary value in terms of percentage of wage, how much it's valued, these characteristics of the public sector. And finally, we measure the asymmetric effects of gender of public employment and public wage policies. Okay. So when we go to the data, I've showed you these graphs in the beginning. We do the ratio of the 2 bars. So in the left graph here, you have the ratio of public employment shares of women over men. And we do that so we have one statistic that has a very natural interpretation. If under perfect symmetry, you would have this ratio equal to 1. Public employment would represent the same fraction for men and for women, or the share of women in the public sector would be the same as the share of women in the private. So here 1 would be the benchmark, and we see that it's always above 1. So we show it's the same over age, over education, over different regions. But then we also go to education, to industry. So we take out what is health and education. And what we find is it's smaller, this women's overrepresentation, but it's still there. And even it's still there when you just look at US health and education, UK education, and France education sector, there is an overrepresentation of women in the public sector. We also go to three-digit occupations in the US. So these are really narrow defined occupations that are common between the public and the private sector. And we find that in around 70% of those occupations, there is an overrepresentation of women. So the cutoff would be in 1, so you see 2/3. So there is naturally an effect of preferences, of the selection of the occupation, but we think it's not the whole story, there's more to it. Now, we also show here only for US and Spain, the stocks. So these are the percentage of people, men and women, in private employment, public employment, unemployed or inactive. These will be the statistics that we'll use to calibrate the model. But very important to calibrate and identify the mechanisms in the model is this the differences in transition probabilities. So this is the probability of moving from employment to unemployment that is higher in the private sector than the public, but also the probability of exiting the labor force. When you look at the probability of exiting the labor force, it's actually lower in the public sector. So if you are a public sector worker, you are less likely to withdraw from the labor force. And this is particularly true for women, and it's really large differences, for instance, in Spain. And it's these differences across sectors in the probability of exiting the labor market that we will use to identify what is better work-life balance.
Pedro, can I ask a question?
Yes, yes, of course.
Sorry. Looking at these figures, I don't know if you check the age structure of the woman in the public sector, because one of the main reasons that women left the labor market is pregnancy and all that stuff, right? So maybe it has to do with age composition of people. I don't know.
Well, so we looked at the education so the gender overrepresentation, so the overall representation of women across age, and it's fairly constant. And the thing is, at least the European surveys, and I think the CPS as well, when you are on maternity leave, it doesn't consider you inactive.
Okay, I see.
A special characteristic. So clearly, maternity matters. We won't model it explicitly, but we'll. It's in the back of our minds that because women will, have the traditional responsibility from. But we think that will matter for having a different distribution of outside options. So women have a higher value of home production. So we think about this exiting of the labor force as something more permanent. It's not just specific to maternity, to the maternity leave, but it is influenced by the fact that if you have kids, you are more likely to withdraw from the labor force, but then it's lower in the public sector. So we think that this is interesting because the job security, so you also have that effect on the inactivity.
Can I ask something just about when you showed us the differences about employment and occupations? These do not control for education. This is just the ratios as they are in the data, not taking education into account.
Exactly, but when you go to 3-digit occupations, then it's already quite narrow. So usually it will be homogeneous within that. But for example, when I show the industries, no. Then we also show by education, and it's similar. So there is not kind of a big difference across education groups.
Very good.
Okay, then we also estimate the public sector wage premium for men and women. There are many empirical papers that do this, with better methods, but we just want to be consistent across countries. We find, for example, the US, men are paid 5% less in the public, women are paid 6% more. In Spain, we have a 7% premium for women, a 0 for men. And we estimate a gender wage gap in the private sector, 30% in the US, 20% in Spain. So the numbers for the US are higher than the usual literature because we use gross yearly earnings instead of hourly earnings. Okay. So what we'll use, this will be how we'll identify these different characteristics. So the lower gender wage gap for women, we just take it from the data by this estimated public sector wage premium. The better work-life balance, we get it indirectly through the lower flows from employment to inactivity and how they are different between the public and the private sector. The job security, we take to match these flows from employment to unemployment, and the preference, we take it as a residual. So really what we are going to do, we are going to identify very well the effects of these three characteristics, and anything else that we can't explain, that's the residual, we'll put it under preference. This could be a preference for occupation, but also it could be a preference for a common good, no? Okay, in the model, it's a search and matching model. So we have men and women, so M and F, and private and public sector, so G and P. It's continuous time, risk neutral agents discount the future at rate R. There is at rate tau, a new generation that retire or die, and a new generation that is born. And when they are born, they draw a preference for the public sector. And this will be different for men and women. It can be a negative, so it can be, it doesn't, you might have a distaste for the public sector. And if you have a very large epsilon, you will join the public sector. If your epsilon is below a certain cutoff, you'll enter the private sector. And here, so its markets are segmented, and the decision is ex ante, at the moment that you enter, and then you'll stay in your labor market. So this is different from my previous papers, where you do the decision when you are unemployed. We think it makes sense when we look, because a lot of the decisions when we talk about becoming a teacher or a nurse, it's kind of an occupational choice. So you have this ex ante, then within it, each market, you'll have three states. So you'll be unemployed, inactive, or employed. So you can think this in a diagram. In the beginning, you draw a preference, and then you compare that with the gains of the two sectors. You decide either to go to the public or private, and then there you'll be moving around between unemployment, employment, and inactivity. You can't find a job from inactivity. You have to become unemployed then to find a job. So at rate lambda, people draw an X, which is the value of home production, and these can be different by gender. So women potentially, because they have higher inactivity rates, it's going to be that their distribution of this X is shift to the right. They value more, they either to take care of the kids or the parents, and they have, this distribution is shift to the right. So the flows utilities, and here we followed Vasmer and Garibaldi. If you are inactive, you just benefit from home production X. If you are unemployed, you benefit from X, but you have to sacrifice some of the time by searching for a job. When you are employed, you have to sacrifice a lot of your time, but this sacrifice is going to be different across sectors. And this is what we think about as work-life balance. That in the public sector, you might enjoy more this outside option or this home production X. Whether you are employed in the public or private, you get a wage. That's what's the benefit of working, but then you sacrifice on a percentage of the home production. And there is an exogenous separation rate at rate lambda. So I won't show the value functions. This is like how for an individual, for a worker would look like. Solving this model in three states is solving for two cutoffs. One is the cutoff for which of X, if you draw a very large X, that you decide to quit. I don't want my job anymore, that makes you indifferent between being employed and being inactive. Then there is a second cutoff, XA. It's if I'm searching is the moment I stopped searching and become inactive. And because of that, you have a kink in the employment value. So you'll have two expressions. If you have low X, this is what's called the employed that are attached. If you lose your job following a separation rate, you would try to look for a new one, you'll be unemployed. But if your X is in between these two cutoffs, if you lose your job for an exogenous reason, you actually decide not to search for a job and just go to inactivity. Okay. So you'll have a scheme like this, a labor market like this, both for men and women in the public and in the private sector. Okay, so I'll jump this. Then This is the flows. If you are unemployed, if you find a job, you'll be employed attached. But you might at some point, if you have a certain X, be employed not attached. And the difference is only if I have a separation shock, if I'm attached, I'll just go to unemployment. If I'm not attached, I'll go to inactivity.
Sorry, Pedro, is there vacancy creation? Do firms create vacancies according to?
Yes, yes.
So these lambdas are actually endogenous. You just have them as lambdas for.
So the pie. So the job finding rates. That's yes, it's endogenous. But we'll see, because what then going to be for the firm, for the perspective of the firm, and for a perspective of the government, that you have both men and women searching for jobs. And the composition of employment in the public and private is going to mimic how many women and how many men are searching in each of the markets. Okay, so so in the private sector, and this answers your question. So the model can become quite complicated. So we want to simplify in one dimension, which is in the wages of male private sector workers. So we don't have a Nash bargaining, we have a simpler bargaining process that just take a fraction beta of their productivity, of their flow productivity. And so that means that they won't respond to any other conditions and policies. So this gives the value for a firm of having a male worker. Now, for the female wage determination, we follow Albanese and Sahim, that we find it's a very intuitive method, and we find it's quite nice. It's the value of a job for the firm is the same for a male and female worker. So when the firm hire, there's no reason to discriminate. But because firms are going to anticipate that women are going to quit, they are more likely to quit, then they are going to pay less, they are going to offer lower wages, such that the value of the job is the same. So in a way, it has an endogenous theory of gender wage gap, which is we are going to, firms offer lower wages because they know that they are more likely to quit. So there is a link between inactivity and the lower gender wage gap. Yes?
Mass bargaining would give you that, but I guess with a lot more algebra in a much more complicated way.
Exactly.
And then the value of the job would be factored in there.
Exactly. So we want to simplify that angle, because really then it becomes quite messy because of the interaction of genders within the labor market. But now there is a problem with this, and it's quantitative. It's whether we can get the right exogenous wage, we can get the right gender wage gap that we find in the data. So whether this endogenous mechanism can really explain the gender wage gap in the private sector, which is very important to understand the selection of women for the public. So what we assume that on top, we follow the misallocation literature to assume a wedge, and it's exogenous. So women only get 1 minus alpha of the wage paid by firms. So this is a tax. We don't explain where it comes from. It can be related to discrimination, other things, but we just take it to be able to match the data. So there is an endogenous element of the women's wage, but then we have this wedge that's exogenous just to have the right calibration. Other papers use say for instance that the productivity of women is lower, but we find that just having a wedge is more agnostic on the sources. So then you have the job creation for the private sector, and this is one of the features of the segmented markets. So it would be different from Luca and Mauricio and from Ioannis' paper, because there you have an impact on the ability of workers. But here, the public sector doesn't affect the tightness of the private nor the wages. How the public sector affects the private sector is just the scale of the private sector. So when the public sector increases the wages, you have more people going to the public, fewer people in the private, and then there is a one-to-one fall with vacancies, but tightness remains constant. So when one unemployed decides to go to the public, then just vacancies fall 1-to-1. So it's a very particular mechanism of crowding out. That's different from random search. Now, finally coming to the public sector pays an exogenous wage premium for men and women. The premium is exogenous, but the wages are endogenous. And the only thing the government needs to do is the same as previous papers. The government hires a certain number of workers. So it only has to hire the workers to replace the ones who retire and the ones who separate to unemployment and inactivity. Now, because government employ women and men in different proportions, it matters. If they employ more women, they are more likely to exit. The government also has to open more vacancies to replace. We assume the minimum, the matching function is the minimum between vacancies and unemployed, and this is without loss of generality.
Sorry, Pedro, just to understand better. So these pies are different for men and women.
Yes, so women will have a gender wage gap in the private sector, so they'll be paid less than men. But then but when they compare their wages in the private to the public, they have a higher premium in the public, and this we take from the data. So for the US, this pi f would be 1.06. For men, it would be 0.95. And we take them as given. Okay, so where does it come from? Well, you have a gender wage gap in the private sector. It's just because of more regulation. You still have a gender wage gap in the public, but it's just to a smaller scale.
Yeah, no, I understand that you want to basically differentiate the gender gap. I was just wondering why you wouldn't fix the same wage for men and women in the public sector.
So that's one possibility, and that would give you a much higher premium. But there's other ways of discriminating. So, you might give the same wage for the same level, but if women are not promoted, it's in practice is a certain discrimination. So it's what we observed, that there's still discrimination in the public sector, but it's much less than in the private. Or discrimination, the gender wage gap is still there, but it's just lower than the private. Okay, now this is an important point. So then we come back to just the first initial choice of the sector, and if there was without this preference, then suppose that there was a perfect symmetric world, that everything would be the same for men and for women, the share of women in the public sector would be undetermined, because everyone would have the same incentives, and it would be undetermined, the gender composition in the perfect symmetric world. Now, suppose from this perfect symmetric world that women are just, the premium is just slightly higher in the public sector, then more women would want to go to the public, but then this would reduce the probability of finding a job for both men and women. So then men would then prefer to go to the public, but then women would go, and there would be only one equilibrium where only women go to the public sector and only men go to the private sector. And this is because there wouldn't be anything heterogeneous across individuals. So this preference for the public sector wage premium plays a role in a sense that it breaks this bang, this undeterminacy, let's say. So even if women always prefer the public sector, or their incentives in terms of wage and better work-life balance pushes them to the public sector, not all. Some women would still prefer the private, and also some men, even if they don't gain as much as women in the public sector, the ones that really value, the public service, they would also want to be in the public sector.
Can I ask? So you know this better than me, but in the development literature, people worry a lot about that, about how motivated the public employees are, and this idea of contributing to the public, and sometimes they worry about hiring people that are skilled but but not like, motivated enough. This seems like a very nice way to speak to all of that stuff, right? Is, of course it needs to be parameterized by some data, but it looks like a very parsimonious way to capture motivation, contribute, all these type of things that are not in.
Yes, then there is a link missing. So this literature, they think that this public sector motivation affects productivity in the public sector. So it's not just about your ability, but also if you are more devoted to what they call pro-social motivation, then also affects productivity, which here is absent. But that's a bit yeah. In here, that there's kind of a very pragmatic way, which is for the selection not to be only. Otherwise, it wouldn't be specific to an individual. Women will always want to go, and men would never want to go. And in this way, it breaks the link. So just summarizing, the value of home production is different across men and women, so are the preferences. And there is the wedge on female wages. This varies across gender. And then there is the differences across sector in the time cost, the work-life balance, the exogenous separation, and the wages. So I won't go into the calibration. We fix some parameters. We calibrate with a simulated method of moments, so just trying to minimize the difference to from 70 targets. We also use the duration, the unemployment duration, and we also use regional variation across US states or Spanish regions and French regions to get the dispersion of these preferences. So you need some type of variation across steady states, and we use regional variation. So I'm in my last two minutes, so we still have 5-minute break. Main results. So we have a benchmark and we do the composition exercise. So we basically change different things at different time to see if there were no differences in sector or in preferences, then this public employment ratio would actually be smaller than 1 because women will be more inactive. So actually it will be less than 1, and we try to see what explains what. 3 things. Preferences matter. They matter especially for the UK. The second is the wages also matter, 50% in France and about 1/3 in the US and Spain, this higher wage premium. The time cost, the better work-life balance matters for the continental European, France and Spain. If you live in Spain, you know that in the summer, public sector workers finish working at 3. So you are not surprised with these numbers. Now, what's perhaps surprising is that the job security actually attracts more men into the public sector. And the reason is that men have higher wages than women, and they have lower distribution of X. So the opportunity cost is higher in that sense. So they value more the job security. They would pay more for the job security. So in terms of quantitatively, the work-life balance premium, so how much would private sector workers sacrifice for the work-life balance premium is particularly high in European countries. In the US, it's only about 3%. In UK and France is 12% for women, 8% for men. And it's very high in Spain, about 40% for women and 24% of men. In terms of the job security, it's about 1% in the US, 1 to 2% in the US and UK, because unemployment rates are lower. In the countries with high unemployment rate, France and Spain, it goes something between 2 and 4%. And then the final result is just whatever the impact of wage and employment policies, it's always double in women's, for example, unemployment rates. So you increase wages by 1%, it raises unemployment rate twice as much for women. You hire more workers, it reduces the unemployment rate twice as high for women. And I stop here so we can still have 5-minute break.
If I'm sorry, my camera doesn't work, so you can't see me, but if I can maybe make a couple of comments to this paper and a little bit also to other papers. So about this, I take it a little bit with a grain of salt because I saw this a long time ago. But if I remember well, for Italy, the share of women in the public sector that changes a lot between the south and the north, and in the south is actually lower than in the north. And this is against the fact that in the share of public jobs in the south is actually a lot larger than in the north. So I don't know how it fits with your model, but I think it's an interesting twist.
Yeah. So this would be the share of women, but is it relative to the private sector? Because I presumed also in the private sector they would be.
In the private sector, yeah, I think it's relative to the private sector as well, but that is, I'm not sure, but it's definitely the share of women in the public sector is lower in the south than in the north, while the share of the public sector itself is much bigger in the south than in the north. And the wage premium, and this is, I think, this is what explains a lot. Maybe this is connects to your paper. The wage premium of the public sector in the south is a lot more than in the north. So it's probably like the mechanism that you have about the preference of job security that crowds out the women from employment, and more men try to get the job there. And it goes to women have a participation rate in general that is around less than 40% in the south, so it's very low. So women that don't get in the public sector actually stay at home. So there is an interesting.
Yeah. So there is okay. So a few elements. So the regional variation is very. So Italy has the difference between north and south gives. It's very, very, very interesting case studies. So there is one issue that the premium, you always have to see for the magnet how different it is for men and women. So it's not just about the level of the premium, but then the asymmetry across gender. So for instance, in the US, men, it's a 10 percentage point difference. So men are paid 5% less with the data from the CPS, and women are paid 5% more. But if you go to Sicily, if I remember, it's about the public sector wage premium is about 40%. Then it really depends. It's also pretty high for men, right? So then men would also be attracted. So it really depends on the two. And then it would interact with inactivity, but it's actually quite interesting to look at the data and the comparison of north and south.
And then I would like to make another comment that this is also for other papers. I hear a lot about job security, but I wonder if this is still really a big issue for the public sector, in particular in Europe. Like, I'm wondering, in particular, I know that a little better France and Italy. And nowadays in France, for example, a large share of public jobs are actually contract jobs. And the job security for those jobs is nothing different from private jobs. And this is the same, similar in Italy. In Italy, it's not as big, but there is also the possibility to hire people not by concours or exam, but by contract, and usually these jobs are not secure at all. For example, in the education sector, there are thousands of, tens of thousands of teachers in Italy that they work from September to June, and then go in unemployment, and then they pick up again later. And those are considered, they don't even have the salary for the summer. Those are considered public employees anyways. So
So it's true that in some of the countries, so not so much in the UK, but in France and Italy and Spain, the temporary contracts are also high in the public. So that's why. So we, in our case, we go to the micro data, so we can check the flows. So just by looking at the flows, and even when you look at conditionally, when you do conditional flows, they seem on average safer, but it's far from the zero. Job separation probability. On top of that, there is people just kind of move towns and quit their jobs. but you still see that on average, the probability of being unemployed in the following quarter or in the following months in the US, it's lower in the public sector. So even if they are not protected by law, sometimes you have just more recurrent contracts, or then they'll try to put you in. So even if you have a temporary contract for a while, then you are still more likely to get in at some point. So you just see fewer transitions. But it's true that in especially Italy, Spain, and France, the share of temporary contracts in the public sector has also been increasing a lot. Yeah.
Can I also respond to that? So regarding and maybe say something about Greece. So in Greece, again, if you're hired in the public sector through the processes we're highlighting, your job security is guaranteed in the constitution. There is no way you can be, they can fire you. Recently, what happened when the government wanted to get rid of public sector jobs, it just allowed people, it gives very high incentives for people to retire and quit voluntarily. Now, having said that, in the new data set I mentioned that we have started looking, there is a very fine, which I guess is very similar to what Pedro and Zoe have been looking, because it's the same European labor force survey. There is a very fine definition of the public sector. You can see, like, workers who are employed in private, but they're doing public sector projects and stuff like that. And we're going to look at that. So definitely there is the data to give a very refined answer to your point, which I think is a very good point. But for macro purposes, I do consider that the job security is an important aspect of at least in Greece that I have.
Yeah, no. I mean, I do agree it's an important aspect. I'm just wondering, and in particular, so the age composition, because the job insecurity of in the public sector is more related to younger people that are hired than older people. But even within the same job, I can tell you, because in France, when I worked in France, I was hired by a public employer with a temporary contract, and this is a job as a university professor. So it does exist. Like you wouldn't have this kind of things maybe in Greece, but it does exist for the public administration for exactly the same position. The possibility to hire as a temporary contract. But then I wanted to ask you something. This is it's not a big comment, but you were talking about as a motivation that the public employment is important in Greece. An example where there were 1.5 million people for like 90,000 positions. I mean, I think this is evidence that people have a very, very low opportunity cost of participating to these exams, because I mean, this is a lottery. There is absolutely, even for the best of those people, it is absolutely no guarantee to get the position. So it doesn't sound really like a mechanism that can discriminate the best. So I wonder what is the rationale for people to participate in an exam where there are 1.5 million for 90,000.
So again, these were aggregate data for a decade. So I showed you data for
it's not one exam.
10 exams. No. Probably
okay.
It'd be safer to divide these numbers by 10 to give you.
Okay, so those are not the proportions that the people participate to a single. No, I didn't understand that.
Yeah. No, sir, I wasn't clear enough. I went a bit far. So I think it's safer to think that for one exam, it's around 5 to 10,000 positions, and between 100 and 150,000 people apply.
Okay, 10 times. Okay, so it's not too bad. Yeah. Okay.
But Vincenzo, at least the previous version of Ioannis' paper, they had one quote from the Bank of Italy, and they were saying there were 30 positions, 85,000 applicants, and it was an unskilled position, and they still shortlisted, and a lot of, on the thousands, they had to do exams on statistics and English. So Ioannis always surprised me with kind of larger numbers even. But I think, okay, so it's 5 past. Vincenzo, do you want to take over?
Okay.
And present? You should have the share screen.
Yeah. Now I'm getting the. I think this is it.
Yeah, brilliant.
Okay, so I have to apologize in advance if my presentation is going to be a little bit chaotic, but this is a paper that with my co-author we started a very long time ago, and now it's sitting for a while for as a revised resubmit, and the revision is getting really low because my co-author didn't care so much about job security, and from the public sector of the university chose to go to the private sector in the United States, where I think the wage premium is actually pretty significant. But she left me a little bit, not alone because she works, but not as much as if she was in academics. So let me go to the motivation. Grant is okay. We have talked about it a lot. But grant size is important. So this paper is going to be about does the government have a role in stabilizing the economy? So basically this is really like the purpose of this paper. And we collected some data to check if there is an effect of fiscal policy in general in terms of public employment or public wages. And we saw that the answer is quite complicated, and there are several channels that need to be clarified to give an answer to this question. So empirical question, research question, what is the empirical evidence on these effects, and can we rationalize with a model this? So with two strands of the literature, Quadrini and Trigaris, and then Gomes. We can't. Every time we basically try to revise the paper, we have to add another Gomes. So I just put dots. And in terms of the micro time series literature, also Gali, Fatah, Mihov, and others, and my co-author, as well as another paper on the same subject. And it will be clear where this literature meets the rest of the literature. So our contribution, so a new set of stylized facts, at least we hope that what we propose as empirical evidence is going to be taken as facts. Then a model within the searching and matching literature that can explain these facts. So basically, we are not making many, we're not going to make many changes in the model, and but just the necessary to actually have the public sector that will act in the way that the data tell us that it is acting, I mean, the effects are. And there are three channels: a bargaining channel, a tightness channel, and a product market channels. So, which is a purely, so it's a purely real model. So the product market channels is really what the twist of the model that makes the difference and explains basically the facts that we are going to see. All the three channels are important. So what are the data? Data is about the US. So we observe not public wages, private wages, private productivity. Now, actually, in this version, we don't use it anymore. Public employment per capita, private employment per capita, unemployment rate, and the sector employment shares and population. Okay, so some of these variables are not going to be that important, but obviously employment and wages are the key variables that we are going to talk about. Those are repeated cross-sections of US metro areas. And actually, here is with the averages, but no, we are taking all the data right now. And from 2001 to 2018, so basically we do have a panel of metro areas for these 18 years in the US. So okay, let me. So basically, we put together these log public wages, log private wages, public employment and private employment, and also the wages in terms of growth rates, and also the growth rate square, which is going to give us a proxy of volatility. And then we use, we set up a panel bar system, okay, with metro areas and the years of fixed effects, in which the main identifying assumption is going to be that, this is one of the most important parts, is going to be that the government moves before the private sector, okay? So, there is a feedback from the government to the private sector, but there isn't a feedback from the private sector to instantaneous feedback from the private sector to the public sector. And this basically gives us a nice structure of the VAR in which we can identify the effects of public employment shocks and public wage shocks. So basically innovations within the VAR, okay? And what are the effects of these innovations on the series of other dependent variables? So what we find is that the shocks of a public, so this is those are long run effects. So meaning this is basically the sum of the impulse response functions of the public, for example, for the first one of public employment shocks onto the other, all the other variables. So the public employment shock, we see that has, first of all, here, private employment growth square. So this is a volatility, this is the measure of volatility. So we see that has a negative effect on volatility in employment. So which negative effect basically means that has a stabilizing effect on employment. So this is a very important, very interesting fact, because we see that indeed there is a role for fiscal policy to reduce volatility in private employment, and therefore also reduce volatility in unemployment. Then it has also a negative effect on private wages, and this is quite quite counterintuitive, if you will, because we might think that the increase in public employment could instead increase through tightness, increase also the leverage for public employees to increase their wage. And it has a negative effect on private employment as well. And this is quite understandable and expected because this is a crowding out effect. Although the coefficient here tells us that the crowding out effect is not it's not one, so it's not one-to-one crowding out effect. So three important effects: it lowers the volatility in public employment, has a negative effect in the growth rate of private wage, and a negative crowding out effect, a negative effect on private employment. So there is also a relationship with public wage. Of course, it's the relationship is positive, and on public employment, of course, is quite natural. Going to the the wage growth shock, we see that it has basically no effect on volatility, or it has a positive effect maybe, but it's not significant. So it's not significant, maybe significant at 15%, but anyway, it's not significant. It has a positive effect on private wages. So the increase in public wages increase private wages, and it has no effect on private employment, and also obviously it has a relationship with public wage as well. So so the other results are not as important. To summarize, business cycle volatility, public wages has a positive or unidentified effect on business cycle volatility, while public employment has a negative effect on business cycle volatility, so as a stabilizing effect. In terms of private wages, public wages have a positive effect on private wages, and while public employment has a negative effect. In terms of private employment, public wages it has an unidentified effect, while public employment has a negative effect. So the challenge here is that a standard model, a standard search and matching model, with a standard model would be difficult to disentangle the different opposite effects of public wages and public employment on private wages in particular, and on public and on business cycle volatility. So that is where basically we find that is interesting. First of all, we find it interesting to see that there is a positive effect, I mean, a negative effect, a stabilizing effect of public employment on business cycle volatility. But to understand how this happens, to understand what are the channels, we have to take into account also these other effects, and these other effects go in a standard model would go in a direction that is not possible to rationalize. In particular, it's not possible, it's difficult to rationalize why increasing public wages would actually have a negative effect on sorry, I lost myself a little bit. Public wages. So a public employment, a negative effect on private wages. That's the most challenging effect. And while it has a stabilizing effect on the business cycle volatility. Okay. Anyways, the model is a search and matching two sectors model with the public and private sector and random search. I don't think I need to go through much, because everything is pretty standard, and you won't find anything that is quite difficult to understand. So productivity is the same for private and public. Obviously, we have exogenous. Okay, we have exogenous aspirational rates. The probability to find the jobs are going to be endogenous. So the outside option, this is an important part. Outside option B for unemployed is going to be endogenous. Okay, we'll see what that means in a second. So those are the flows in a steady state matching process with higher circular marginal cost gamma, such that gamma is going to be equal to gamma upper bar and theta 1 minus alpha, A actually, the elasticity of the matching function. Okay, so this is the part where things are a little bit different from usual. So we assume that there is a household's utility function. And the household is actually collecting all the agents in the economy. And these households values consumption with this utility function. So basically, the household is agents are risk averse, so they are not risk neutral. If this sigma is, we see the values later in the simulations. And also there is some value of government goods, public goods, and some value of unemployment, or let's say some loss of utility given by being employed either in the government or in the public sector. Okay, budget constraint with all the wages and employments, and there is a lump sum tax and some profits, and the government's consumption is another feature that is very important within the model, because the form of the government consumption implies that basically the government good is equal to psi parameter times the employment in the public sector. So basically, the government gives as many goods as a fixed amount of goods that is decided precisely by the public employment in the economy. And then, of course, there is a budget, government budget that is balanced every period. So market clearing implies that the consumption is going to be equal to this function, and therefore it has also this part that is due to the exactly related linearly and exactly related to the government employment. And the equilibrium in goods market determines also B, such that B is equal to B upper bar, which is a parameter, times the consumption to the power of sigma. So that's where the sigma comes into, the risk aversion comes into play, which basically endogenizes the outside option, the value of unemployment, by taking into account the consumption itself. So this is basically what will drive most of the results, and that are also related to public employment here.
Vincenzo, this is analogous to the wealth effect, no, in an RBC model, that you consume less than you are willing to work. So your benefits, your outside option is lower, so then you are willing to work for a lower wage.
Yes, there is a wealth effect, and the wealth effect though is also directly caused by the public employment.
Okay, Vincenzo, 10 minutes, yeah.
Okay. So I thought, but yeah. I mean, anyways, the rest is quite standard. The private wage obviously as a part that is related with the government wage, and well, I mean, so we do a calibration of the model, a calibration in which we take many of the values either from the literature or directly from the from the data. I think there is something particularly strange about the calibrations. We make some assumption about the workers buying power 0.5, normalization of productivity to 1, and the match elasticity equal to 0.5, and the sigma, we start with the utility parameter equal to 1, log preferences, but we play a little bit around this this parameter to see if it changes a lot the results. And what we find is that indeed we are able to recover some of the or all of the results in terms of the responses to the log public wage to the okay, response to the log public wage shifter is a shock. So we see that we basically match a positive value for log volatility. We match a positive value for log private wages, and for private employment a negative value. So and going from 0 to 1, sigma going to 0 from 1 basically makes the difference in terms of the capability of the model to actually match this design, at least. I mean, the actual number is harder to pin down, but the sign is what we are after. The responses to public employment shift against log volatility. So that is so this is probably one of the most interesting results. Log volatility, we really need the sigma to be equal to 1 to have a negative effect, so to have a stabilizing effect, and at the same time to have a negative effect of log private wages to the increase of public employment. And also crowding out effect, but this the crowding out effect actually without risk aversion is even bigger. So to lower down the crowding out effect. And this is private productivity. This is something that we don't really have in the data, the results anymore. But just to see private productivity as a stabilizing effect in our model, while in the data with previous results wasn't the case, and log private wages and private employment positive effects. So, we have some robust effects, but to be brief,
Vincenzo, you still have 6 minutes, so you don't.
Okay, no, it's. I think I'm anyways done. So what we demonstrate a number of new stylized facts for the U.S. data, and this is the part that in the last year and more for the revision we worked most, because the first set of results were referee was a little bit skeptical, actually with very good arguments, but we reworked the whole empirical part, and it was very interesting to see that everything is really holding. So at this point we checked several different ways to estimate the model, and we find consistently the same effects. These effects are compatible with a search and matching model in general equilibrium, and but the three channels, bargaining tightness, and the product market, and in particular product market, which is the newer part, are needed to explain to basically fit these effects. Main takeaway: high public wage is not necessarily stimulative or stabilizing, but high public employment seems to be stabilizing. Conclusion: what was this? already what I said before. So yeah, I'm. You still don't see me. I'm sorry about.
So sorry. Do you have the expression for the derivatives? No, the sensitivity of tightness, or no? Do you have them there?
Yeah, I do. Just a second. I mean, I do. I have the paper.
No. So don't worry. But so I wanted just to ask on the cyclicality. Then so these were the set of how you calibrate for the cyclicality of public and private wages that you get from the VAR. So the endogenous response to the other shocks, no? And how does that? But then, did you play around with different cyclicalities?
You mean in the model or
no, afterwards? So
no, yeah. In fact, it's not really cyclic. I mean, cyclicality is probably is not the right word, because it's really volatility. And so basically, what I mean, the VAR model takes into account the square of the private employment growth. So it's really volatility. So it's really like
So that I understand. But then there is there is an element of the cyclicality of the wage and the employment policies. I think you skip that slide, no? Can you? So if you go to the government just before, after that, yeah, the government. So there is no cyclicality of the wage policy or the employment policy.
No, I mean it's not. I can answer this. So basically, no, there is not cyclicality in the sense that it is really like we really talk about volatility in the sense that is how things would change more or less when we have shocks in the wage or in the public wage or the public employment.
Okay.
So I mean, like, we think in terms of business cycles because this is obviously these changes happen in time. So if you think I should have maybe
no, I think so. If I can say so, it's analogous to how Pissarides was looking at the cyclicality of vacancies with respect to the productivity. You are doing that with respect to the wages and employment in the public sector.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's clear. Very well. Are there more questions, Ioannis? You had
about the results. Is there, when you showed us the table with the different values of sigma and how the results change? No, yeah, excellent. No, this one. Thank you. If I get it right, does it say that? So if we go to the last kind of row, responses to log private productivity, there, and for different parameter values, this, as we go to the right, this means that the volatility to productivity shocks decreases. Or I don't read
the volatility. The volatility. So this line here, this means that the reaction of volatility to private productivity decreases. I mean,
is this a Scheimer? Is it related to the Scheimer puzzle, or because how I read it is that if you want to have sigma equal to 1 to match the public responses, then you have to sacrifice the response to, in terms of volatility in shocks to productivity, which is there a trade-off between the Scheimer puzzle and, capturing the?
So basically, what the model does is, and I mean, we are increasing the B, the outside option, when so we are causing potentially more fluctuations with the B, but also we are endogenizing the B by taking into account the public employment and at the same time also the volatility of in consumption. So in a way, yeah, we are reproducing somehow the Hager-Maronski effect by playing with the outside option, and this is how basically we generated these effects. But importantly, it's I think what it is important is that we relate this directly with public employment, because there is what is I mean, what the facts say, that public employment actually has a direct stabilizing effect on the on private employment. So,
but is there, just to make it, is there a trade-off that in order to capture the facts about public employment, the Scheimer puzzle becomes worse, or it is an extra win, or it alleviates the problem? That's what I'm trying to understand. By making the model capture the public stuff, does it make its performance better or worse with respect to the the volatility, the shocks in productivity?
Well,
we can talk later if it's not.
Yeah, no, yeah. So okay, let's talk later about it. Yeah, because this is something that I have to.
Yeah, I think so. Let me jump in. So I think it's better to move on, but then we'll stay. We can stay here a bit after the for the ones who want to stay a bit later. Diogo, do you want to take over? So the last presenter, Diogo, the methodology, the models will be different. This will be a growth model, so there won't be, as far as I'm aware, search frictions, but it just highlights the kind of a different mechanism. So
okay, so
yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so can you see the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so before I start, just let me say that I'm enjoying a lot the paper so far. Thank you, Pedro, for organizing everything. Yes, and yeah, it's going to be pretty different from what we've seen so far. So let me start here. I don't need to talk about the importance of the public employment. Pedro did a great job in this beginning of the workshop, and all you guys gave us a lot of motivation to work on public employment. So just let me jump in to the research question, which is what are the effects of the size of public employment on economic growth? And just to highlight what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put forth an endogenous growth model to show that there is an inverted U-shaped relationship between public employment and economic growth. And what I'm going to show after the model is just that the model kind of replicates the relationship that we observe in the macro data, aggregate data, actually cross-count data. And after that, I'm going to show that I can extend the model to include the quality of labor, as most of you did in your paper. I don't have skilled and unskilled. I have human capital, but it kind of captures the quality of labor. Okay, so that's the roadmap of the presentation. Okay, let me just really quick talk about the literature. This idea of inverted U-shape between government size and economic growth. It has a long tradition in economic growth. Barrow started with that in the 90s, and if you remember borrow production function. We need a little bit of government in order to produce. We need public goods to do that. And at some point, actually at the beginning, production increases with the size of the government. And at some point, the government is just crowding out the private sector, and that's bad for the economy. However, most of those papers, they talk about the government as a competitor in the final goods sector. It's the government crowding out the final goods sector. In my paper, is this kind of the same idea, but the crowding out happens in the labor market, not in the final goods market. In terms of public employment and development, a lot of papers, Jamovich and Rudd, they talk a little bit about these public employees which are motivated. So as government sector increases, we have less motivated people and less entrepreneurs in the private sector. So this is bad for the economy. And a lot of papers talking about mislocation. Cavalcanti and Dos Santos is one of them. Some of you guys talk a little bit about mislocation as well. Gomes and Koehn also show that the larger government sector, more crowding out in the public sector, in the private sector, and production, GDP or production output decreases. What I'm doing different from those papers is that most of those papers are talking about output. So output is going to be smaller. I'm going to talk about growth. I'm going to talk about the incentive for innovation of the private sector instead of production per se. Okay, so the model, I'm just going to highlight the main elements of the model. I'm not going to go into derivations or anything like that. The model is very simple: three agents, three economic agents, the government, firms, and the household. The government's going to produce cost-saving services, G, which are public goods that reduce the cost of the firms to produce. You can think about that as roads, safety, anything that it makes easier for the private sector to produce. And this production is done through a production function that takes only one input, which is the share of public workers in the economy. Other than that, the only thing that we talk more about the government is the government budget, which is all the expenditure with public employees is equal to the revenue. And that's all about the government. That's all what the government does, is just hire people to produce public goods.
Quick question. So the subscript P in this case, public sector.
Yes,
so
yes.
Then you call it WG, the wage, I presume. But it's the public, yeah, it's just.
It's the wage in the public sector. Yeah, I should normalize this,
Just,
but
that's fine.
Okay, then we go to the firms. Firms are going to produce differentiate products. So we're going to have a model with varieties here. And the production of variety new is going to be given by the firm's productivity, which depends on the average productivity of the economy times a choice of innovation that the firm will do. So the firm can increase its innovation by investing in new methods of production. So this is the part of the productivity. This is the part, this is just labor. This is the amount of labor that the firm chooses to hire minus some cost in terms of labor. So what's this cost? What's the idea of this cost? Is that, okay, suppose the firm hire 100 employees, but not all of those employees are going to be directly producing output. Number of those employees are going to be working in bureaucratic parts of the firm. They're going to deal with things that the government could provide, like leading with bad roads or bad infrastructure. So this part of this cost is the variety independent part of the cost. Okay, there is a second part in the cost, which is the cost of innovation. A share of these workers are going to be working in coming up with better methods of production. Okay, so this cost, kappa nu, is going to be a cost of producing in terms of labor force. Okay, so the main idea of this guy here, and this is basically where the government is going to enter directly in the production function, is that a share of workers need to deal with the bureaucracy or need to deal with something that the government imposes. So if the government creates cost-saving public goods, then we need less workers to deal with those costs. Okay, is that clear?
I think it's
okay.
Very clear. It's very
yeah,
clear.
Yeah, go ahead.
My personal benefit, I don't know these things too well, but is this something standard, or like people in the growth literature, like some of the papers you cited with the inverse U stuff, do they model that public sector like that, or is this one of your innovations that you bring to the table?
Kind of both. So the part of the public employment and growth, this is new. Okay, the thing is, what the literature usually do is the size of the public sector in terms of final goods. So usually the production function is going to be the Bauer production function with the Cobb-Douglas and the G there. So why I need this, why I use this, is because I want to link the labor market with, I want to create a crowding out in the labor market affecting the economy.
Gotcha.
I'm pretty sure that there may be other production functions I can use, but as you guys will see, I'm building on another paper which links the size of the economy with growth. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show that actually the government can either increase the size of the private sector by facilitating the production, producing goods and services, but on the other hand, the government can crowd out the private sector by reducing the amount of employees available here. So that's why I need this kind of production function. Okay. Okay, for the consumers, we have varieties in the preferences as well. We're gonna have consumers that have a most preferred variety, and those varieties are distributed along a circle of varieties. And what's happened is that the individuals are going to only choose consumption. Basically, they're going to choose where they're going to work, but the choice of where they're going to work is very simple. They're going to choose consumption of all the varieties that they can see in the market. The thing is that they have a discount. If the variety is far away from your most preferred variety, you have your utility is discounted a lot. So if I like chocolate chip ice cream, and the only variety that there is in the market is, I don't know, plums, ice cream, I will eat that ice cream, but I will have a discount in my utility. Okay, so that's the idea. You have a most preferred variety, you're going to choose the varieties in the unit circle, and you're going to choose only the variety that's closer to yours. Maybe yours is not produced, so that's bad for you, but you're going to go to the closest one. Okay, so that's the idea of this utility function. And of course, the households are subjected to constraints, so they're gonna, their expenditure needs to be less than their income, and their income comes only from wages. And the decision where to work is pretty simple. They're gonna work in the sector that gives the higher wage. In equilibrium, wages are gonna be equal, so there is no premium here. There is no public sector premium. We could have, that would make things even worse in terms of dropping growth, the growth rate. But I mean, we can show the negative effects even without the public sector premium. Okay, so those are the households. Any question? Okay, so in the equilibrium, what we want to show is, I mean, Desmet and Parente showed that already. There is a relationship between elasticity, price elasticity of demand, and innovation. So what we're going to do is we're going to derive the same relationship in our model, but what we're going to show is that what we're going to show is that these relationships are going to be a component. There are actually two components of the government size. The government size will affect these relationships, and in two different ways. It can increase innovation, or it can decrease innovation. So what's happened is that we can have two relationships between innovation and elasticity. One is positive and comes directly from the firm's optimal choices. If the elasticity is higher, you're going to produce more because you have more substitutes out there for your product. Your market power is smaller, so you want to come up with better methods of production so you can increase your profits. So if there is more competition out there, firms will have more incentives to come up with new methods of production. Okay, so that's this has nothing to do with government right now. This is just from the optimal choice of the firms. Okay, the negative relationship is the one that's related with the government. And yeah, we can work out in the algebra, and we're going to get this relationship between elasticity and the size of the market, the number of firms in the economy. So if you have more firms in the economy, elasticity is higher because there are more substitute goods to your firm, to your variety there. The thing is that the number of firms in the market affect, the size of the government will affect the number of the firms in the market. And that's the point where the government gets in here. So from the equilibrium in the labor market, we have that all workers are either in the private sector or in the public sector. And the number of workers in the private sector is going to be the number of firms times the number of workers that each firm choose. So we can just solve this, and we're going to have that the number of firms in the market depends. So here we have, for the first time, the government affecting elasticity. If you have larger government, this is the crowding out effect. Okay, so we have less workers available to the private sector, so we're going to have less firms in the market. Okay, so but this is question.
It's not that straightforward, right? I mean, on the one hand, you take workers away from the private sector, but you make the government, you improve that S production, which saves firms.
Exactly.
So it's not obvious how this works, right?
So yeah, so what we have here is that this is the first effect that you mentioned. That's the crowding out effect. We have less. The thing is that the optimal amount of workers is going to depend on the savings on the public goods available. Okay, so here are the two effects that the government can have. The government can have a positive effect by reducing costs in the private sector, but at the same time, the government can have negative effects by reducing the amount of workers available in the private sector. And here again, so when we plug in M in this elasticity equation, we have another relationship between innovation and elasticity. Actually, elasticity is here as well. But this one is affected by the government in two ways. Okay, so what we have is two relationships between innovation and elasticity. What we're going to do is equilibrium happens when they are equal. And so, sorry, this is the negative effect overall when you just plug in this equation in here. So this is what we have, is the negative relationship between elasticity and innovation. And notice again, the government will affect this relationship. Okay, in two ways. It can be good by reducing costs of production. It can be bad by shrinking the private labor sector, the labor force. Okay, so when we put those two equations together, you're going to have this pretty ugly equation here, but that's our equilibrium. This is from where we get the optimal innovation given the parameters, and the size of the government would be a parameter for us. I mean, I'm not taking the government choices exogenous here. I'm just asking what happens if the government increases the share of employment So this is the proposition. This is basically the result of the model. So in a symmetric equilibrium, if the elasticity of operational costs, which is this guy here, to the share of labor in the public sector is bounded, so I don't want that thing exploding, otherwise I don't have a solution. The relationship between economic growth and the share of labor in the public sector is non-linear. Specifically, this is going to be a hump-shaped curve. So if you have too little government, that's bad because you have a lot of costs in the private sector. You need to hire a lot of people to do these things that the government does. But as you increase the size of the government, you start to crowding out a lot the private sector. That's bad. So we have the bad part of the government, the declining part of the curve. Okay? Questions?
No.
Okay, so this is the model, this is the result. Just let me show you a little bit of empirical evidence. I use data from the World Bank bureaucracy indicator, thanks to Pedro for the tip here. So this is data on public employment. The ratio of, I'm going to show the share of public employment. The ratio is over total employment. And this includes state-owned institutions. Okay. So the thing about this data is that it's mostly data for developing countries. So we have a lot of developing countries in the database. The other thing is that it sounds like a nice panel, but it's not. For many countries, we just have one or two observations, so it's not that good as a panel. So the analysis I'm going to be doing is basically just a cross-section for the countries that I have more than one observation. I just take the average. And what we have here is, yeah, it seems that we have a inverted U relationship between the share of public workers in the economy and the average growth rates. I didn't mention average growth rates are measured with the Penworth tables, GDP. And this is the average growth rate between this period here. When we plot a quadratic fit, we have that this is actually a nonlinear relationship, inverted U relationship. So this is what we see in the data. Of course, I have regressions showing all the stars that we want, control for initial income, control for human capital, the stock of human capital. So everything, I'm still have results there. So the other piece of data I want to show is about the provision of public goods. So having a higher share of workers in the public sector gives more public goods. A big question is how to measure public goods. I'm just following Desmet, Ortuño, Martin, and Waxiagi here. They just get a bunch of variables that they consider that the government should provide, like education, health, infrastructure, and they get the principal component of those things, and boom, we have a measure of public goods. I'm gonna also show a business cost index, which is a survey ran by the Global Competitiveness Report, where they ask private sector entrepreneurs, what's the cost of a variety of things that the government should provide, like security? So what's the cost of terrorism? What's the cost of crime? What's the cost of bad regulation, the cost of bad infrastructure, health, and education? So again, I just take the average of all those indexes and I call this a business cost index. And what we see is that, I mean, it's pretty intuitive, but some people like to see these, is if you have more people in the public sector, you're gonna have more public goods. Sounds like we have some diminishing returns there. It's okay with that. More importantly, the cost of producing in the private sector seems to reduce. At least people complain less in the countries with more public workers, with a higher share of public workers. So again, have regressions, have stars for that, control for a bunch of things, and That's what we have. So the mechanism that we are using in the model doesn't seem to be something like crazy. If you have more workers, you produce more public goods and you reduce the cost of production of the private sector. Okay? So what I'm gonna do next is some numerical exercise. I'm gonna just plug in numbers to my parameters. I'm going to say that the production function of the government, of the public sector, is this one, but actually I just put alpha equal to 1 because I have in the private sector I have constant returns. I want to have the same thing in the public sector, but it doesn't really matter much. Beta is important. Beta is this discount, is how consumers dislike or lose utility when they consume goods that are far away from their most preferred variety. How we calibrate that? We just follow Desmet and Parenti, they calibrate that, but the idea is that this is gonna give us the markups of the firms. And we can use this beta to match the markups of firms in the economy. So we just put that 0.5. The other two parameters we need to care about is eta, which is the elasticity, how much the cost of production drop when you increase the share of the amount of public goods in the economy. And this is the cost of innovation. It links the size of innovation with the amount of workers that we need to innovate. So to calibrate those two, I don't want to say calibrate, but to choose numbers for those two parameters, I just run two exercises. I mean, we can just choose the optimal growth, sorry, the optimal size of the public sector and see the growth of the economy at that optimum. So what we do is we use the data that we just got and we say, for example, here, so we just say the optimal is around here, 0.27, and with this optimal amount of workers, economies would grow around 4% a year, which is a lot, but remember, these are developing countries, they are supposed to grow fast. So this is one exercise. The other exercise is more one country. I get data from Ficini and Melki, and they estimate the optimal size of the public sector in France. So they just estimate that to be 29.1%. And they see that the growth would be 3.2. So I just have two exercises for those two parameters here. One where I match the optimum in the data, in the World Bank data, one in which I match the optimum for this optimal growth of France. Okay, and what we see here is that it's very little parameters. I'm basically calibrating 3 parameters, and I get the inverted U shape. Okay, so we cannot see this as an actual calibration. Okay, this is more a numerical exercise than anything. But what's important to see here is how the model fits the quadratic fit, which is supposed to be optimal, at least for richer countries. When we go to poorer countries, the model doesn't do very well. And I mean, we can come up with reasons why. For example, that fee, which is the cost of innovation, probably the cost of innovation is lower if you are poorer. So that would bring this left-hand side here up a little bit. So we could play with a lot of things. What I just want to show here is that with a simple choice of parameters, the model provides a inverted U shape that the proposition just showed. Okay, and that we're not that far away from what the estimation of a quadratic fit would get. Okay.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, I wouldn't. I think it's pretty good for numerical exercise. I think that your main contribution is theoretical, but still the numerical exercise now. Because if I got it right, there is one point that that you match.
Yeah.
Maximum.
Yeah, for the blue line, there will be a point here that matches the data.
Exactly.
For the orange line, yeah, it's gonna meet here at 3% growth and 0.29. But other than that, we get the shape. So that's kind of what I want to show with this exercise here.
Brilliant. And do you want? Is there any other questions? I think one of the takeaways is that so the macro literature more general, so not the search, but just the more macro fiscal policy, they tend to think about G as purchases of goods to the private sector, and but then it's very different when you look at employment, which is actually the majority of G. It's different because it affects the market of inputs. So the implications for wages in the private sector, they are very different because you are affecting two different markets. And in your case, you bring that to the growth, to an endogenous growth model. So that's pretty nice. Plus, the equations, they are really not as complicated as when you do search. They are much
Oh yeah,
much
that's
bigger,
true. Yeah.
and it's very neat to see actually analytical results, which you can sometimes in search, but then when they become too complicated, then you don't have any other choice but to put numbers. But excellent. So I think we are done. So I want to thank all of you for coming in and presenting. It would be actually impossible to have this if it wasn't for COVID. Otherwise, in between Santiago and Florida and California, France and England, it would be very hard to actually meet up. But I don't know, we can hang out here a bit longer. Who wants to leave? There are no beers, but thank you very much for coming, and yeah, good luck with the paper. But at least amongst us, we know what everyone is working, and I think that's very useful. Okay.
Yeah, if I can,
Of course.
now my camera is also on again. So
finally we can see that.
No, the answer didn't. I was thinking about the Scheimer puzzle. So it's,
Okay.
I think I was very unclear in the presentation. The volatility is a volatility still in relationship with productivity shocks. So